Hello, welcome to week 12. We're drawing near an end, and this is now looking at health and stress. And we're going to begin with stress. And what is stress? We'll look at some of the conditions of what makes up in terms of a theoretical model about what stress is. And we'll look at what some of the theories look at, or what the role of stress is, or how stress affects us. We'll look at a few theories that are ones that you might not necessarily be highly aware of in terms of the title, but you might be familiar with them in regards to your own experience with stress. We'll also look at just some basics around the implications of stress and what that means to us and how it applies to us. It'll be a relatively brief chapter on this because I'm going to spend a little bit more time on the second part. All right? So good luck with this. Make sure you have your textbook available because we're coming up again to the end of the semester. That means another grading system test. So please be prepared and good luck to you on this chapter.
Okay, we're going to look at health and illness and the different approaches to this now to remind ourselves that there is a general term called stress, but then there is bad stress, which is distress, and there is good stress, which is eustress, and eustress is E-U-S-T-R-E-S-S. Now, stress is just basically the kinds of things that gets us to respond in some capacity. It's a change in physiology and sometimes in thinking and in behavior. But the bad stress or distress puts us in a difficult spot and we have to try to cope, and usually this means we aren't coping quite as well, whereas good stress can be motivating stress. The physiological and psychological response to a condition that threatens or challenges a person and requires some form of adaptation or adjustment. And that's what stress is. I'll say it again. The physiological and psychological response to a condition that threatens or challenges a person and is requiring some form of adaptation or adjustment. So that if it gets too cold, physiologically, you feel cold, and so you put some clothes on, or you warm up, you put on the heat, or you put on some additionally warmer clothes. That's your adaptation or adjustment to the physiological response and perhaps psychological of how that makes you feel to be cold. So when we're looking at these different approaches, we'll begin with biomedical approach to looking at stress, and this is where the focus is on the illness rather than the health. And so the focus is more on the distress of what stress can do to oneself and the effects of that and the illness related rather than the health. It looks at the biological factors. And now that's been an important feature, and it's not one to be ignored, but it's just one model. A second model is the biopsychosocial model. And this focuses on the health as well as illness, looks at both sides. But it also looks at the psychological and social factors in addition to those biological factors. And so if you can see through the image there, there's multiple elements that can contribute to distress and the effect of stress on a human body. Now, lastly, we have health psychology, and stress, as I've said, has become a major concern to psychologists, and the area of health psychology is devoted to developing ways to make people healthier, primarily through understanding and lessening the impact of stress on our lives. And so, as much as they recognize those psychological factors that contribute to health and illness and the response to illness, they're about promoting interventions to foster good health and aid in the recovery of illness. And in the second part of this next week, we'll look at more at what kinds of things can enable us to have good health and therefore deal with stress an awful lot better than without good health. So why do people get ill? Well, beginning in the 20th century, the main reasons people got ill and in fact died were pneumonia, infectious diseases like diphtheria and tuberculosis. But today, we're more likely unhealthy lifestyles and stress that's going to affect what gets people ill. Heart attack, stroke, hardening of arteries, cancer, cirrhosis of the liver. These are all lifestyle diseases. Now, when we look at stress, it's been researched quite a bit. And one of the Canadians that had a big impact on looking at stress was Hans Selye. His work was on what was called a general adaptation syndrome, where all organisms are constantly confronted with stressors, and the organism essentially continues to adjust to return to homeostasis or to establish that sort of balance. And he looked at the normal state, if you will, as going through 3 stages in this balancing. The alarm state, which is stage 1, is where the heart rate starts to increase, the blood pressure increases, our blood sugar levels increase. This gives you and I this energy to cope with the stressful situation. And then the second stage, once the alarm stage has readied us, the resistance stage is stage 2. And here the adrenal cortex continues to release glucotides and helps our body to resist stressors. And then after a bit, we'll run out of our ability to cope and resist the stress, and we enter into the third stage of exhaustion, and all the stores of deep energy are depleted. Now, it's important to note that some of what we'll be talking about next week are all the things that can help us remain healthier, and the healthier we are, the better we are able to resist and remain healthy through that resistance. Currently, if you're not in particularly good health and it's a lifestyle issue, then when we are resisting, it depletes our resources and it makes us more susceptible to illnesses and disease. So you consider, if you've got someone in your family who is older and is needing some support, the alarm rate is now you've got a change in your lifestyle that includes caring for an elder family member. The resistance would be the amount of stress of day-to-day doing the care, as well as all the other things that you have going on in your day. At some point, you will have a depletion of those resources, and that will be the exhaustion state. The criticism of this particular strategy of adaptive general adaptation syndrome is it didn't consider any of the psychological conditions or how a person perceives a stressor or how a person evaluates that stressor. And so when we look at the next theorist, we can look at Lazarus and Volkman's psychological model for stress. In a person's perception, it's not just the stressor, but their perception of the stress determines the amount of stress that a person experiences. So a cognitive process made up of primary and secondary appraisal. Now, a cognitive appraisal, essentially the process of thinking about whether or not my stress is bad, is the term for individual interpretation of events in their life. So a threatening or harmful or challenging, and their determination of whether they have the resources to effectively cope with those events. So we go through 2 stages, primary appraisal and secondary appraisal. The primary appraisal is the evaluation of the meaning or the significance of the situation. Whether it affects our well-being is going to be positive or negative or irrelevant. So firstly, we determine whether or not this is going to affect us badly, or is it going to have a good effect on us. And then the secondary appraisal is, if the situation is within my control, then I evaluate the resources I will evaluate what resources I have to manage and alleviate this stress, essentially getting back to homeostasis, if you will. So if the situation is within my control, then I evaluate the available resources to alleviate the stress. So physically, it's either I'm in good health, I have good energy, I have good stamina. If it's social, then I have a social network and support network for me. If it's psychological, then I have either the skills, the morale, or the self-esteem to deal with the stress. And if it's material, maybe it's the money or the tools or the equipment, or it could be time. So when we look at our secondary appraisal, we're looking at a lot of different variables to see whether or not we have whatever resources we need to deal with the stress. And so you can see if we have the more resources we have, the better health, the better social support and network support, the better psychological morale and esteem, the more resources in terms of tools and equipment, or the more time we have, the better able we are to deal with stress. So options are considered, and a decision is made on how to deal with the stressor, and therefore stress level is a function of adequate resources and how severely they will be taxed for the purpose. So when we think in terms of, well, how do we deal with stress and what things can cause this stress? Well, we can look at a variety of things. Well, types of choices or conflicts that we have in our lives causes stress. And these conflicts with choices aren't singly. We don't just choose between good and bad. We could be choosing, our approach to conflict can contribute to how we experience stress and what is stressful. So when we define conflict, this is the stress that arises from knowing that choosing one option requires us to forego another one. So making a decision between two things is what can cause stress, and that's what a conflict is. And so when we consider that we may have an approach conflict, this is a conflict arising from having to choose between two equally desirable alternatives. For example, deciding where to go on vacation. Either decision is a good one, and sometimes this can cause a degree of stress, and again, it depends on a number of different variables. Now, it could be that we're looking at approach avoidance. And this is a conflict arising when a choice is both desirable and undesirable. Do I work out and get into shape? Well, it's desirable because it's good for me to do that, but I have to get up and do stuff to get into shape. And so approach avoidance can be a difficult component when it comes to causing stress for people. And then lastly is approach avoidance. And this is where a conflict arises when the choice is both desirable and undesirable. Sorry, I'm mixing that up. The first one is approach. The second one is approach avoidance. The third one is avoidance, and it's a conflict arising when a choice involves two equally unattractive alternatives. Going to the dentist versus having a toothache. The toothache isn't too desirable, but going to the dentist can also be a feeling of undesirability. So unpredictable stressors are the most difficult to cope with than our predictable stressors. Knowing what you're up against can certainly be easier to deal with than having something surprise you and not really know for sure that it's coming at you. We are less subject to stress when we have the power to do something over it. Now, certainly, the kinds of stressors that we may have enter in our lives require us to solve them in some capacity, to cope, if you will. And there are different coping strategies. And there's a problem-based solution, if you will, which consists of reducing or modifying or eliminating the source of stress itself. So, for example, after getting a poor grade, a student decides to study harder and get a tutor. And so essentially a problem-focused coping strategy is an action-based one. You do something to correct or remove or reduce the stress itself. Now, it's not the only strategy, of course. There is also an emotion-based coping. This involves reappraising a stressor so that one may reduce the emotional impact. Sometimes you might lose a job, and as a result, you might go, oh, this is going to be a challenge to get another one. Or you see it as an opportunity rather than a tragedy. And so emotion-based coping is more about perception, reframing, if you will, looking at what was an existing problem and framing it or focusing and seeing the perception of it in a more positive opportunity. And then lastly is one that's called proactive coping. And when this consists of efforts or actions that we can take that are taken in advance of a potentially stressful situation to prevent its occurrence or minimizing the consequences. And it's basically a proactive coping. So, for example, eating and exercising, eating correctly, eating healthfully, and exercising can improve our ability to deal with stress. It just allows us to be stronger and cope better with the physical strain that stress can have on us. Now, what you're seeing here is the social readjustment rating scale. This was put out by Holmes and Rush in 1967, and it measures stress by ranking different life events and assigns a value without considering if the life event is good or bad, just that it has stress associated with it. And the evaluation of stressors includes the use of scales such as this one, And there's also one that's called the Hassel scale. One positive side to stress may be the uplifts a person experiences when dealing with positive stressors. Methods of stress management, especially progressive relaxation or stress inoculation training, which will also be discussed next week. Now, by definition, you can call hassles little stressors that include the irritating demands and troubled relationships that are encountered daily, and that cause more stress than major life changes. And so these are the little things that crop up on a day-to-day basis, little stuff that collectively weigh heavy on a person, whereas the uplifts are positive experiences in life which can neutralize the effects of the many hassles. And so if you look at that list, you should be able to see some of the examples there. The more things that you would check off that have high scores, the more stress that one would be experiencing, and therefore, more coping strategies would be required to be balanced, if you will. Whereas some of the things that we might experience as being, that's not a very stressful thing. It's not that it's stressful negative, it's stressful in terms of how we're having to deal with it. Okay, well, this is just the beginning at looking at stress. It's a very brief and overview, and you'll find additional information in your textbook. I hope this is going well. We have one more week, and then we are on our way to the last test, and then we are done. All right, well, thank you very much for your time and paying attention, and we'll see you next week. Bye now.